How are you guys doing? How's everything? How's the conference going so far? Are you having a good time? All right. How many people here know about Hypermedia? Even know what it is? A few of you? Just a couple. Okay, then you're going to find this session valuable. Because by the end, you're going to be getting hyper over Hypermedia. So why care about Hypermedia before we even describe what it is? It's really about helping you to build more maintainable systems, decoupling between clients and servers. And before we get into really looking at how we might apply it, we need to describe what it is. And I figured we would start by looking at a bit of background, because this term is not new. It's been around a long time. So back in 1945, this guy, Vannevar Bush, he wrote an article where he was thinking about the way we think and describing a system that would be able to make these kind of loose associations with data, which is really, at the end of the day, what Hypermedia is. And his thinking there inspired this guy, Ted Nelson. Who knows who Ted Nelson is? Anybody? Anybody know why this guy's significant? He was one of the co-founders of Itty Bitty Machines. You know who the Itty Bitty Machines are? IBM. So he was a co-founder of IBM. And he was inspired by the previous thinking, and he started to thinking a lot about writing. And he was saying that, one of the challenges you have when writing is that often ideas are very kind of loosely associated. They're not just sequential types of structures. And that what happens is that when you try to write today, like you try to write a book or something like that, you have to take those very loose associations and put them into some type of sequential association. And then the reader has to try to decompose that. And he basically was thinking of, is there a better way that we can do things? Can we somehow represent data or writing in a way that is very loose and that has like a flow to it, to represent complex ideas? So what he was saying here, he was talking about how this was very difficult to arrange things into these sensible structures. And he said, what if we could just bypass all those challenges by having a non-sequential structure? And that idea formed into something that he called hypertext. So he started to describe this idea of, imagine that you had all this information that was somehow loosely connected, and you could bidirectionally jump back and forth. And that deeply influenced this guy. Anybody know what he did? Or who he is? Tim Berners-Lee? Yes, creator of the World Wide Web. And so if you look here in his proposal for hypertext, his proposal for the World Wide Web, hypertext was central to the idea of the World Wide Web. He said hypertext is a way to link and access information of various kinds as a web of nodes in which the user can browse at will. And he said that it will allow a single user interface to navigate this world of information that will be available, otherwise known as the World Wide Web. So he was really taking this concept of hypertext and saying this is going to be part of the foundation of what the web is about. Then there's this guy. Who knows what he did? Or who he is? Anyone? This is Roy Fielding. Well, Roy Fielding created HTTP. So he was the creator of the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So hypertext is to the very core of the protocol that you use for communication on the web. And then he came along later on and he wrote this famous dissertation where he talked about the REST architectural style. And in the REST architectural style, he described really what was the web built for? What was the infrastructure of the web and the protocol? What type of systems would you build on top of that? And he called the systems that that design, that idea, that architectural style, REST, representational state transfer. So one of the things that Roy was very clear on with REST is that it's a set of constraints. There's 5 different constraints. And one of those constraints has the word hate in it, hagios, Hypermedia as the engine of application state. Hypermedia as a term is an evolution from hypertext to mean more than just text, to mean images, media, etc. So if you look at your browser, you can get links that will link you to other kinds of documents, but you can also have links that will link you to videos, to audio. It's very, very rich. And that is what hypermedia is about as a term. And so one of the things that Roy got pretty upset about is he noticed this emergence of, as people started to leave just doing things in the browser and they started to build out APIs, which were just being consumed by arbitrary clients, he found that one of the key things that was missing, central to these APIs, was this idea of hypermedia. And he described what he thought was the problem. He said that, what do I have to do to make it clear to people that this is not optional, that this is what REST is really about? Now, he wasn't saying you cannot build an API that was not RESTful, but what he was saying is if you want to call this thing REST, it must have this characteristic to it. It must be hypermedia driven. And so the way he described it is he said that these APIs that are not RESTful, they're not using hypermedia. They're not allowing the hypertext to drive navigation through the application. So he was very clear on it, and he was like, hey, this cannot be a RESTful API, period. And then he described what a RESTful API should look like. He said a REST API should be entered without any prior knowledge of the URI space, other than an initial URI, a bookmark. And that from that bookmark, the client should then be able to navigate based on the results they get back throughout the rest of the system. And he also said that the kinds of links that the server will return back, that the author of a RESTful API should spend more time describing what those links will be and not what the URLs will actually be. Because that is what will allow that client to be able to navigate. And basically what he said after that is, he said after they've made that first initial request to that URL that they know, everything else after that, they will just follow the results that are passed back from the server. So some people in the REST community, they like to describe this as following your nose. Basically, this is the term they use. But basically what they're saying is nose in this case means like, hey, I'm just getting stuff back and I'm just following it. I'm not actually hard coding any logic against the URLs of the system. So that was Roy's complaint. Now, I'm not here to tell you that you must use hypermedia, and I'm not here to tell you that you must build RESTful systems. So let me clear that right off the bat. I'm not going to stand here and say, oh my God. Actually, I was going to get some REST police to come in, but I didn't have time to organize that. But what I am here to do is just to explain to you what hypermedia is, what the value is, and then you can decide if you're going to use it or not use it. The other thing I will say is that there's more and more APIs that are starting to actually take advantage of hypermedia in order to get the benefits that it provides. So I started off with that background history to show you that this is not a new concept. It's been there from the beginning. And if you look in Roy Fielding's dissertation, I have highlighted right there in chapter 5 where he talks about REST, he basically says that this chapter is going to describe this architectural style called representational state transfer, which is a style for distributed hypermedia systems. So my point in all of this is when you hear somebody say the word hypermedia, this is not something new. This is something that's been around for a very long time. And he basically describes a little bit more in his dissertation when he talks about the uniform interface. So the uniform interface of HTTP is the fact that whenever you talk to an HTTP resource, there's a standard way to interact with it. You have HTTP methods like get, put, post, delete. You have headers. All of this is defined in the HTTP spec, and he calls this the uniform interface. Why is it uniform? Because it means that any resource that you go against, if it's exposed over HTTP, you know how to interact with it by virtue of the fact that it implements this interface. In contrast, if you think about like SOAP services, without having some WSDL document or something else that describes what the methods are that are supported, or the actions that are supported, and what schemas are acceptable, I really have no way to be able to interact with that system. So let's break it down, and let's just talk about, let's get rid of all of the complex wording, because in actuality, hypermedia is quite simple, and you're living with it today. Hypermedia is central to the way your browser operates today. The challenge becomes when you step outside of the browser. Because when it comes to the browser, everything is taken care of for you. That's why you probably even haven't thought about this term, because you just haven't been thinking about it. Really what hypermedia is, it simply says that when the server returns a response, in addition to returning a payload or a document that will get represented, that document or that information will contain within it links to go to other resources. Now that is something you see every single time you browse. So if I go to open my browser, well, here I'm on GitHub, perfect example. So here I am on GitHub, and I'm browsing my repos, or in this case, I'm browsing the ASP.NET Web API Contrib organization. So here I see this Web API Contrib formatting.razor. Do I know what the URL is when I go to click on it? Do I care? Somebody tell me. Do I care about what the URL is? No. All I do is see a description. So, and once I get there, then I see other links. Like, oh, I can drill down here. I can drill into samples. So this navigation is something we're all used to in the browser. However, once we step out of the browser, conventionally how we've done stuff is not that way. We basically end up having clients that have a lot of hard-coded knowledge about, OK, I'm going to do this. Then after that, I want to go get this other information. So I'm going to build up a URL. And then I'm going to build up another URL to get this other information. And the problem with all of that is that server cannot change. If that URL, if the resource on the server changes, now my client is broken, because my client has to know how to build up those URLs. It's not a problem here, because every time I come to GitHub, I'll be able to just look for the description that I care about. So really, the challenge around hypermedia is how do you take that idea and translate that to when there's not a browser. So here's an example of a catalog. In this case, let's think of it as a catalog as a website. And that catalog can have previous and next pages to take me to the next catalog page or the previous catalog page. That's a data-oriented link. But I can also have workflow-oriented links. Again, we're just talking about it in a web page right now. So to an order website where I could go and create an order. And after creating that order, I get back a page that has some buttons on it. One of them is to approve the order. But if the order was already approved, the button doesn't show up. So this way I can do pretty sophisticated workflows. But each of these workflows, the server is really guiding it. The server is the one who's doing the rendering. Now, once we start to move to more client-side scripting, where the clients are doing lots of work calling out these APIs, that's where the problems start to happen in browsers today, because that's where the tendency is to just kind of hard code that information. So when we're talking about hypermedia, we're talking about links. At the end of the day, whenever you hear somebody say, ooh, hypermedia, just simplify it. It's really just links. It's just about servers that return links. The challenge is the API. So a hypermedia API is a web API, not something that's necessarily going to be accessed from the browser. Could be returning JSON, could be returning any kind of representation. But in this case now, it's going to contain also additional linking information which clients, which are non-browsers, can use. So let's take an example of an API that is not a hypermedia API. And then we'll look at a hypermedia API so we can see the difference. And then we'll actually go through and build a simple one. So this is, who knows what API this is just by looking at it? Anybody have a guess from that screenshot? Can you see it? Twitter, yes. Anyone want to give a guess of why this is not a hypermedia API? No links. You just won. There you go. I had to give it to somebody. There you go. Congratulations. There's no links here. So if I want to access this API and I want to say, OK, I want to go look at, I want to go back to this user that I got this tweet from. Well, I see that there's a screen name of gblock. But how do I know how to get to gblock? There's no information that the server has fed me. So my client has to hard code that knowledge, right? And then if the server changes for some reason, that client is now broken. So there's a very tight coupling between the client and the server. How does the client even get that knowledge? Well, often that knowledge will be communicated in an out-of-band fashion. Maybe Twitter will have some documentation that I can follow. But it's out of band, which means that I've had to hard code this into my app. Now here is a new API from PayPal. And this API is actually Hypermedia driven. And there's an abbreviation that people use, happy for Hypermedia API. And so here we see that PayPal, when I'm creating like a transaction, it's actually giving my client back a set of links. So now, instead of that hard-coded logic, the client can actually just pick up those links and figure out where to go. Now, in my earlier example, like when I showed GitHub, I basically had, like, I could read the human-readable description that said, hey, this is my repo that I want to go to. And I didn't care about the link. When you start getting into Hypermedia APIs, it's the same concept. The difference is that there's no visual, there's no image, there's nothing like that that can tell my client that this is an interesting piece of information. But there is this thing called a rel. So when we look at links with Hypermedia, there are two core components, and some use a third, which is method, or add additional metadata. So if we look at that first link, I don't care about the URL. It could be anything. It could just be a GUID. But the second part says there's a rel. And that rel says self. Well, self is a universally understood relation. It's actually published. These relations are published with IANA. And self means this points to the actual resource that the representation is returned as part of. So here, when I see this self link, that's telling me if I want to get back to this thing I'm looking at, this is the link to follow it. That's useful if I was to copy that information and store it somewhere else. It means my client just has to look for the self tag, and it knows how to get back. Let's look at the next one. The next link that's there has a rel of refund. So refund means if I post to that resource, I will get a refund. Again, my client doesn't have to know the URL because the URL is served up from the server. How will my client know what those rels mean? That's a question. What I can tell you is they're not going to know what those rels mean based on the link, the URL where they got the information from. Because Hypermedia is all about keeping the client decoupled. But they can know from PayPal's general documentation that it can describe and say, here's all the rels that we provide in our payload. And actually, PayPal does have this on their documentation. And the other way that when you're returning a payload, you can inform the client that, hey, this is more than just JSON and XML, is actually using the media type. So whenever you get back a response from a server, there's a content type. And the value of that content type is what's known as a media type. Now, all of you are probably familiar with things like application/JSON, which is just JSON. But all that tells me is this is a payload that is parsable by a JSON parser. It doesn't give me any real semantics of, hey, this is actually an order, or this is a transaction. But nothing stops you from creating other types of media types. And this is what companies are doing, like a PayPal media type. So now when I see this PayPal media type, I automatically know that there are rules applied to this payload. And I can look at those rules, and that's how I can figure out what the different rels are and what they mean. The last thing I have there is this rel of parent payment. So that is more of a data-related resource. And I can tell that because it has a method of get in this case. Now, the one key thing about Hypermedia that's different about, say, something like WSDL is because of the fact that this is part of the payload, this can change dynamically depending on the state, depending on the application state. And this is what Roy Fielding was talking about when he talked about HateOS, Hypermedia as the engine of application state. Each time I get a response, I only get the links that are appropriate to me based on that point in time and the state of the resource. If refund is no longer valid because of the fact that this already shipped or something like that, then I won't get a refund link. So what the implications are for the client is clients have to be designed so that they look for the presence of these links. And they're not hard-coded, because some of those links may not be present. Instead, they're more reactive. They're designed to say, if this link is present, then I know what this link means, and it's one of the options that's available to me to follow. Does that make sense? So the beauty of this is now I can evolve my server. I can add new links. The older clients ignore the ones they don't know. V1 of my client doesn't know that there's a new link for history. It doesn't care. It just knows about the links that it knows. But then I can ship a V2 client that's able to access an order history archive. And the two live very nicely side by side. And all of this because of the fact that they've been decoupled from the URI space and hard-coded logic, and instead they just look for the presence of the links. So just to high level describe how this works in a visual. So here's my API. So my API is going to return a set of links, and those links can be at any level. They can be high level, relating to the entire payload, but you could imagine if I have a collection of things, I may have different actions or resources that are appropriate as related resources for each of the nested items, and that's absolutely fine. And the client is designed in this reactive fashion to just identify the available links. And based on that, it chooses. Now, often that client is actually a human being. In many of the cases, even if it's not a browser, you might have, say, a mobile app, and that mobile app goes and it queries some result, some data. It gets back a response. It has some links. Those links are basically going to probably correspond to buttons that will appear in the UI so that the user can select and say, OK, here's the available options that I can choose from. Once the link is found, then the client's going to navigate to it. It's going to activate it. How it's going to activate that link is going to depend on a couple of things. What HTTP method is appropriate for that link? As you saw there, that can be documented inline, or it can also be provided via documentation. How do I know what payload to send that link? Does it get JSON? Does it get XML? How's it supposed to look? These are all places where documentation will come in. So it's not like there's no documentation here. It's just that documentation is focused on the semantics of these links and not focused on here's the URI space. So how does this help evolvability? So first, it allows the server implementation to change. Let me give you a very real example of that. You have an API, and over time, that API needs to scale out. So you decide you want to move things around. Now, yes, you have redirects in HTTP. You can use redirects. But that's going to bind you, and it messes up caches, and there's a bunch of other problems with it. So really what you want to do is say that the next time somebody goes and gets this API, they're going to go to a completely different location. Or maybe we've spanned out so that we're geolocated throughout the world, and based on which location you come from, I'm going to send you to a server that's close to you. If you're hard-coded by URL, that's going to be very, very difficult to do. That's going to require me to do a lot of work on the back end to redirect you and bounce back to the client. But if you're just following links, all I did was change that link. You don't know it, you don't care. You end up at that new location, and the app just continues to function. You can surface new API capabilities as links. I mentioned an example of that with the history. There's another great example of surfacing API capabilities as links. There's a book called Rest in Practice, which I recommend you guys read if you're interested in REST and you're interested in hypermedia. And in the Rest in Practice book, the example they use is of a coffee API, an API for ordering coffee. Like I want to place a coffee order. And imagine this was used, like, say, within a Starbucks. So then they decide, after V1 has been deployed, that they want to add a reward program that allows me to say, hey, well, if I buy coffee and I've already got this reward program, then after I've bought a certain number of purchases, I can just use that to get a free coffee. So that reward program just gets surfaced. That ability to sign up for that reward program or use that reward program for payment just shows up as an additional link. Now, the V1 clients, they don't know about it. So they continue to function their merry way. But once somebody upgrades to V2, suddenly there's this new link that is available. New types of clients can come on board. You can have links that, if I'm a client that knows how to, say, render PDF, for example, then maybe there's a link that is displayed to me that will not be displayed to a non-PDF-capable client. So I can add new types of clients that are living side by side. And then versioning. So versioning is a very interesting one because you can because you have that control of URLs, first off, you could change and say, hey, for a V1 client, this link points to a different place than a V2 client. So you have a lot of flexibility there. So that is the concept. That's the concept of hypermedia. So now we're going to talk about ASP.NET Web API and how can you implement a hypermedia-based system. And we'll walk through a very simple sample, and then I will actually show you some established examples. So I talked about this concept of media type. And media type is a thing that describes the structure and semantics of a response that you received back. So we talked about JSON, we talked about XML, we said you can have other kinds. So there is one very popular media type that supports hypermedia that you guys all know about. It's HTML. HTML, you can actually have an href within your responses, and clients know that that means a link. And there are some folks, like folks at Comcast, that are actually building APIs that are not just used by browsers, and they're just using XHTML as their media type. But there are trade-offs because of the fact that, hey, if I'm really not caring about representing in a browser at all, some people feel like it's a little bit of bending to have to use HTML for that. So there are a bunch of other media types that have emerged for doing hypermedia. And one of those is called collection plus JSON. And collection plus JSON is kind of like an atom for JSON. But it has this notion of links built in. And I'm going to show you a library for doing collection plus JSON. And there is another one called HAL. And HAL stands for the Hypermedia Application Language. HAL is actually becoming very, very popular. So HAL is really just like JSON, only it has a baked-in notion of links and resources. It's written by a guy named Mike Kelly. So in Web API, there's a couple of different places where you can handle applying hypermedia, and this is what we're going to jump into now. So one of the places, how many people here are familiar with ASP.NET Web API, have used it? You're familiar with formatters? Formatters are an extensibility point in Web API that are responsible for taking the model that is coming from your controller, or a model that is coming, or a payload that is coming in, and it transfers back and forth between the model and a representation. So it can take just a standard object that was returned and transform that, encoding a result that has links. So this is one place that built into Web API that you can use for creating hypermedia formats. Another approach is not to use a custom formatter at all and just say, hey, my API returns JSON, and up within my API controller, I basically encode a bunch of links. I add those links in. So both of those models are common models that people use when they're doing hypermedia with Web API. So I figured we'll just jump in and let's take a look at a sample of what I mean when we're talking about hypermedia. OK, here we go. So the first thing I'm going to show you is let's just create a very simple example. So I'm going to create a new Web API project. So I will create an ASP.NET MVC for web application. Actually, I'm going to use an ASP.NET empty web application because that already sets you up for a web API. So when you go to create these different projects, if you want to just have an API, you can actually just start with an empty application. Wait, let me just see here. Actually, let me do that one more time. There is a web API template, yeah, but I'm going to start with, I'll start with empty. I just chose the wrong empty. This actually sets you up with a bare bones web API solution that doesn't have jQuery and all that other stuff because I don't need that for what I'm doing here. So I'm going to create a controller and I'll call it orders. And I'm going to make that an API controller. Now, for this example, I'm basically going to be doing an order approval or processing system. So I'm going to expect that I'm going to have some links that are going to relate to how that order is going to be, how I'll be able to transition through the different states of that order. So first, I'm going to create an order. And I'm just going to give it an order number. And then I'm going to have an enum called order state. And I will have new, approved, shipped, and let's say closed. So my order is going to have an order state. Now, this is the order that I'm going to store within my database. I'm not going to actually have a database here. So one question you have to deal with here is, where do you put the linking information? If I have models, I don't want to put that within my models. So there's a couple of different ways that you could do this. One is to actually create just a class called link of t. And then you can basically have a t there. But if you do that, then you're going to need to have a custom formatter so that it doesn't write it out as link of t, but so it writes it out as actually an order. So what I'm going to do is do more of a DTO model. I'll just call it order DTO for now. And so that's going to have really a duplication of my properties here. And I'm also going to create a collection of links. So I'm going to create a link class. And that link is going to have on it two things. I'm not going to go with method for now. So I'm going to give it a rel. And I'm going to give it a URL, which I'll just call an href for now. So now my order DTO is also going to have a collection of links. And I'll just initialize that. And then the other thing I'm going to do is actually accept a list of links on my constructor. Actually, I can just set this equal to links. So now, all I'm going to do, and this is going to be just very simple, is I'm going to have a get that's going to return an order DTO. Actually, let's put an ID in here too. So I'll have a get here, int ID, that's going to return for me my order. So now comes the question of, OK, so I've got an order, and now I need to have some type of repository probably for storing my orders. So I'm just going to, for now, I'm just going to make this simple. I'm just going to put a collection right on the class. You wouldn't do this, really. So I'll just say list of orders. Should be private. Actually, I don't need a property. Sorry about that. And in my constructor, I'll just new up a new list of order. Sorry. And I'm going to just add an order to it. So I will add an orders dot, oh, sorry, orders dot add, and I'll create a new order, and we'll say that ID equals 1, order number equals 1,000, and order state equals order state dot new. That's a new order. Nothing's happened to it. And we'll add one more. And let's set that to be an order 2,000. And we will set that to be approved. How much time do we have? 2 minutes? Oh my God. All right, we'll get it to work. OK, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my order. And this is where the hypermedia logic is going to come in. So I'm going to create my DTO equal to, so the first thing I've got to do is create my links. So I'm going to create a new list of link. And this is where I'm going to apply the hypermedia logic that is going to say, these are the links that are available. So in this case, I'm going to check my order state. Thanks. Right. Or first or default, but yeah, we'll just leave it as first. So if my order state is new, for example, I'm going to add a link that's going to say that the order is able to be approved. So I'm going to add a new link. And for my href, I want a URL. So Web API actually has this URL helper. Is it URL? What is the URL helper? Right. So there's a URL link helper where you can actually specify your default route, and then you can actually give it a new object where you can say what the controller is. So I could say here that my controller in this case is going to be approve. What am I doing wrong here? Oh, it's bugging out because I don't have a controller called approve. Let's see here. And then I'm going to set the rel to be approve. What am I doing wrong here? Okay. All right, well, let me just add this one last thing, we'll be done. Okay. Well, that would be an example of the code that you would write for taking an order, adding the links appropriate based on, in this case, we just looked at the state for new, but you would imagine for each of the different states that you would create appropriate links for returning the information so that the client could then access those links. So this is just one way to do it. There are several different ways to do it. The last plug that I wanted to make on this is there is a library on GitHub in the Web API contrib repo called Web API contrib formatting.collection.json, and that is a library that will allow you to use that collection JSON format. There is also another library for working with HAL, the Hypermedia application language that I was talking about. So you can go check those references as well. And there's a lot of good stuff on Mike Amundsen's blog about Hypermedia if you want to understand more about Hypermedia in general. Thank you very much.